In the last video, we saw the emergence of Mahayana Buddhism, the second vehicle in the history of Buddhism. And one thing that we noticed with Mahayana is the way that it kind of opened up the tradition to really all people, especially with its new teachings on lay spirituality, the emergence of all kinds of new sacred texts, many of which are attributed to the Buddha, even though they hadn't been known for many, many centuries following the Buddha's enlightenment. And of course, the notion of spiritually advanced beings, which suggested a new pathway to nirvana, one that is based on receiving grace from these Buddhas and Bodhisattvas that we worship in order to receive that assistance. So with all of these new changes, it means that there's going to be a lot of new things happening within this second vehicle called Mahayana Buddhism. Once you have the idea of new texts just kind of popping up, like the Lotus Sutra and the Diamond Sutra, the Heart Sutra, and many other new texts, you're naturally going to open up the door for a lot of different interpretations of this new vehicle within Buddhism. Now, this, in one way, happens on a philosophical level. Now, again, just like when we studied Vedanta within Hinduism, it really takes a great deal of time and energy to fully grasp the significance of the philosophical schools within religious traditions. So just as with Vedanta here, we're just going to barely kind of touch the surface of what's going on in these Mahayana philosophical schools that emerged shortly after the emergence of Mahayana itself. And there are really two primary early philosophical movements within Mahayana Buddhism. The first is known as Madhyamika. Madhyamika actually just gets translated to the middle way. And the key teaching within Madhyamika Mahayana philosophy is the concept of emptiness, right? The Sanskrit is shunyata, the emptiness of all statements that we can make about reality. In other words, what Madhyamika philosophers are trying to tell us is that no statement about reality, about anything whatsoever, contains any sort of ultimate truth or self-essence. Any statement that we make about reality is empty of that kind of ultimate truth or self-essence. Now again, this can get pretty tricky when trying to understand the philosophy of Madhyamika, but on the surface, just think about how well this fits with the broader understanding of Buddhism that we have already studied. Think back to the notion of anicca, the second mark of existence, which means impermanence. The idea there was that everything is fleeting. And in some ways, this is kind of a philosophical way to think about the implications of anicca, that second mark of existence. If everything is fleeting, then that means no statement I make about anything can have any sort of unchanging, ultimate truth to it. Because everything is always fleeting. Everything is temporary. Everything is impermanent. And what that means is that we should avoid getting attached to any statements that we might make about reality. Any understanding that I have about anything around me is something that might be true for now, but I should not get overly attached to it. This is the same stuff we were talking about when we discussed the Four Noble Truths and the three marks of existence. With Madhyamika, you just get a much stronger philosophical foundation for the implications of those marks of existence that we studied in that earlier video. One interesting way where the notion of emptiness has a very practical impact on the continued development of Buddhism happens in later centuries, where the notion of emptiness, which is central to Madhyamika philosophy, actually gets used by a particular female Buddhist who is trying to argue against the notion that only men can make significant spiritual progress and reach nirvana. Now, we already know that the Buddha seemed to suggest that the body that we find ourselves in does not really affect our ability to reach enlightenment. But as centuries continued, you eventually did have groups of monks who seemed to suggest that while it was theoretically possible for a woman to attain enlightenment, it was practically impossible because there were so many barriers and obstacles present by being in a woman's body. But eventually, in many later centuries, you have this princess, this female who comes along and engages in a debate with one of these monks who believes that only men can attain enlightenment. And she right away says to him, "You say that only one who is in a man's body can attain enlightenment. But if you believe that, then even someone in a man's body cannot attain enlightenment." And he says, "Well, why do you say that?" And she says, "Because of the doctrine of emptiness. Because all aspects of our reality, even our gender distinctions, are ultimately empty of ultimate truth, of self-essence. We're getting too attached to our understanding of reality if we make such stark claims about gender distinction. So here is a very practical way in which the concept of emptiness, that key teaching of Madhyamika philosophy, gets used to try to break down the barriers between gender discrimination. The second philosophical movement within Buddhism is called Yogacara, or within Mahayana Buddhism is called Yogacara. It's often called by an alternate name, which is consciousness only. And that's kind of the key kind of term to think about when studying Yogacara. The idea is that not only do our statements about reality lack ultimate truth, but Yogacara tells us that the things that we believe we are experiencing around us actually may not exist in reality. They may simply be aspects of what is called our storehouse consciousness. This ends up sounding at times similar to Shankara's Advaita Vedanta within Hinduism. The idea that nothing around us is ultimately real. It's all coming from our mind, and we have to, in this case, exhaust our consciousness from all of these ideas. In other words, exhaust our attachment to these ideas that are coming from our mind and causing us to believe in this external world to which we can become overly attached. So again, for our purposes, let's not dig too far into the weeds. Just think about how each of these philosophical movements within Mahayana connect us back to some of the foundational teachings from our Buddha, to the idea of avoiding attachment, and to the ideas of the three marks of existence, especially that notion of anicca, or impermanence. And with that, I think the main purpose for us is just to make sure that if we ever get the chance to study Buddhist philosophy in more detail, we will at least recognize concepts like emptiness and consciousness only when thinking about Madhyamika and Yogacara. In the future videos, we're going to talk about popular Mahayana movements, and those are going to be much easier to grasp, and therefore we'll spend more time really trying to understand them because they have a much larger impact on a greater number of Buddhists than what these philosophical schools happen to have.